"Step back, Avery, you are not trained for this," Dr. Ethan Caldwell said without looking at her, his gloved hand brushing past hers as if she were part of the equipment rather than the team, the overhead surgical lights casting a harsh white glare across the stainless steel instruments while the steady beeping of the heart monitor filled the silence that followed. A resident froze mid-motion with a clamp hovering in the air and another nurse lowered her gaze to the floor. Avery's fingers paused just inches from the monitor as she felt the eyes around her shift and then disappear. She hesitated for half a second, jaw tightening, before drawing her hand back and straightening her posture, her voice quiet and even as she stepped aside, eyes still tracking the numbers on the screen while Dr. Caldwell continued without interruption, his tone calm, controlled, and unquestioned as if nothing had been said at all. The monitor continued its steady rhythm, but Avery did not step away completely. She shifted half a pace to the side instead, close enough to see the waveform without being in anyone's way, her hands moving with quiet purpose as she organized a row of instruments that had already been arranged, aligning them again by habit rather than necessity, the faint squeak of rubber soles against the polished floor marking each small adjustment. She reached for a gauze pad, paused when another nurse extended one first, then gave a slight nod and withdrew, her fingers hovering for a moment before settling at her side. The resident nearest to her avoided eye contact, focusing too intently on a chart that did not require his attention, while the anesthesiologist cleared his throat softly and adjusted a dial that had not drifted. Avery's gaze returned to the monitor, not fixed, but checking in intervals, 3 seconds, then away, then back again. Her lips pressed together briefly as if counting under her breath. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, catching herself mid-movement and stilling, shoulders squared again. When Dr. Caldwell called for suction, she moved instinctively, then hesitated just enough to let the circulating nurse step in first, her hand lowering before it reached the tray, the motion smooth enough to pass as deliberate, though a fraction late. She adjusted the edge of a sterile drape instead, smoothing a wrinkle that had no real impact on the procedure, her touch light, controlled, the overhead lights reflected off the metal tools and into her eyes, forcing a blink she did not quite time with the rest of her movements. For a second her focus slipped to the reflection rather than the patient. Then she corrected, chin lifting slightly as her attention locked back onto the vital signs. The numbers held steady, but one value dipped and returned so quickly it could be dismissed as noise. Avery's brow tightened for an instant, then relaxed, her pen clipped to her pocket tapped once against the fabric as she shifted again, a small, unconscious rhythm. Across the table Dr. Caldwell continued speaking in short, precise instructions, his tone unchanged, as if the room existed only within his command. A surgical tech adjusted the light angle by a few degrees, the beam narrowing, sharpening the shadows along the patient's arm. Avery leaned just enough to compensate for the new angle, eyes narrowing slightly as she recalibrated her view. She reached for the chart at the foot of the table, flipping one page too far before correcting and returning to the current line, her finger tracing a set of notes she already knew, grounding herself in the routine. The faint scent of antiseptic lingered in the air, sharp and clean, mixing with the low hum of machines that never fully faded. She exhaled slowly through her nose, barely noticeable, and resumed her quiet observation, present but peripheral, her movements measured, her attention divided between what was happening and what might happen next, never fully still, never fully at ease. Dr. Caldwell did not need to raise his voice for the room to shift around him. A slight tilt of his head was enough for the surgical tech to adjust the overhead light. Before he asked, a gloved hand extended and an instrument was already placed into it without him looking, his focus fixed forward as if everything else existed only in his periphery. When he spoke, it was in short sequences: clamp, hold, advance, and each word translated instantly into movement. The resident to his left mirrored his posture unconsciously, leaning in at the same angle, matching his rhythm half a second behind. The anesthesiologist glanced over more often now, not at the monitors, but at Caldwell's face, reading it like a secondary display. Avery noticed the pattern without turning her head fully, her eyes shifting sideways, then back to the screen. Her hand moved to adjust a line of tubing, then paused just above it as she realized it had already been secured. She withdrew, fingers curling slightly before resting against her palm. She took a half step back to clear space that no one had asked her to clear, then stopped, recalibrated, and stepped forward again to her previous position, the correction subtle but deliberate. A circulating nurse passed behind her and brushed her elbow lightly, not enough to disrupt, but enough to remind her of her placement. Avery shifted her stance again, aligning herself with the edge of the table rather than the center, her gaze returning to the monitor in intervals, but now with a slight delay, as if she were checking whether it was acceptable to look before actually looking. The numbers held, then flickered, a minor variation that resolved quickly. She blinked once, slower this time, and glanced toward Caldwell, not to interrupt, but to confirm whether he had seen it. He had not, or if he had, it did not register in his sequence of actions. He continued, steady, uninterrupted. The room followed. A tray was swapped out before it was requested, a note was written down before it was dictated, everything anticipated, everything aligned to him. Avery reached for a syringe to pass forward, her hand arriving a fraction late as another nurse had already placed it where it needed to be. She adjusted mid-motion, redirecting to secure a loose corner of the drape again. Smoothing it with controlled precision, her shoulders remained level, but her breathing shifted slightly, one inhale longer than the last before returning to a measured rhythm. The hum of the machine seemed louder now, or perhaps more noticeable in the spaces between instructions. She shifted her weight again, this time catching the movement earlier, stabilizing before it became visible. Her eyes returned to the monitor, then to the patient, then back again, mapping the sequence in her head, but leaving space, always leaving space, as if the room had already decided how much of it belonged to her, and she was adjusting to fit within it. Avery's eyes caught it again. Not the number this time but the pattern beneath it, a slight lag between the waveform and the displayed rate, barely a fraction of a second, easy to ignore if you trusted the machine more than the signal. Her fingers hovered over the tubing, then shifted to the monitor dial, stopping just short as her gaze flicked toward Dr. Caldwell's back, his posture unchanged, voice steady as he called for the next step. She drew in a quiet breath, her thumb pressing lightly against the edge of the dial without turning it, then releasing. A beat passed. Then another. The lag repeated, subtle but consistent. Avery moved, not stepping forward fully but leaning in just enough to reach the sensor clip at the patient's finger, her touch precise as she adjusted its angle by a few millimeters. The waveform sharpened instantly, aligning cleanly with the rate, the change small but visible. The anesthesiologist glanced up first, then the resident, their eyes tracking the screen before shifting to Avery. Dr. Caldwell's voice paused mid-instruction for less than a second before continuing, but his next movement carried a tighter edge, his hand extending for an instrument with more force than before. If something needs adjustment, you call it, he said without turning, tone controlled but firmer. The room stilled around the sentence. Avery's hand withdrew smoothly, though her elbow brushed the tray with a faint metallic tap she did not quite prevent. She steadied it quickly, aligning the instruments again with careful precision, her shoulders settling as she stepped back half a pace, not retreating fully, her gaze returning to the monitor, now stable, her breathing evening out as she resumed her position, quieter than before but no longer entirely invisible. The waveform held steady for a few seconds after Avery stepped back, then dipped again, not as sharply as before but enough to create a subtle inconsistency that lingered longer this time, the kind that did not trigger alarms but refused to settle into a clean rhythm. Avery's eyes tracked it, her focus narrowing as the delay between the signal and the displayed rate widened by a fraction. Her fingers pressed lightly against the edge of the tray as if anchoring herself. She shifted her weight forward, then stopped, recalculating. Across the table Dr. Caldwell continued without pause, his tone flattening into something tighter, more clipped. Proceed, he said, and the resident obeyed immediately, adjusting position with a precision that bordered on imitation rather than understanding. The anesthesiologist glanced at the monitor, then at Caldwell, then back again, but said nothing. Avery's gaze flicked toward the fall line, then to the patient's hand, then back to the monitor, mapping the discrepancy in real time. She reached for the tubing again, slower this time, her hand hovering just above it as if testing the space. The circulating nurse noticed and shifted slightly closer, not intervening but present, a silent boundary forming. Avery's fingers curled inward, then extended again, a hesitation that lasted less than a second before she withdrew. The monitor dipped once more, longer this time, the rhythm stuttering before catching up. A faint change in the room followed, not audible but visible in the way shoulders tightened and movements became more deliberate. Dr. Caldwell's hand paused midair for the briefest moment before resuming, his next instruction delivered with sharper emphasis. Hold that position, he said, not looking at anyone in particular. Yet the resident froze instantly, the entire sequence tightening around his voice. Avery exhaled slowly, her breath controlled but slightly uneven at the end. She adjusted the edge of the drape again, though it did not need adjusting, her hand smoothing the fabric with measured precision, buying a second of stillness, her eyes returning to the monitor where the pattern repeated. Lag, correction, lag, each cycle slightly more pronounced. She shifted her stance, feet aligning more squarely beneath her, grounding herself. Her gaze moved to the infusion pump, scanning the numbers, then back to the waveform, then to the patient's hand, tracing the connection between them without touching anything. The anesthesiologist leaned in closer now, adjusting a dial by a small increment, then glancing again at Caldwell before speaking, but the words never came. His lips pressed together instead. Avery's fingers tapped once against her palm, a small, contained motion, then stilled. She took a half step forward, then caught herself and stopped, her shoulder brushing lightly against the tray again, producing a faint metallic sound that drew a brief glance from the surgical tech. She steadied the tray immediately, aligning the instruments with deliberate care, her movements precise but not entirely fluid, a fraction of stiffness at the edges. Dr. Caldwell's voice cut through again. Lower now. Controlled, no. Unnecessary adjustments, he said, the words directed into the room rather than at a person, but the timing left little ambiguity. The circulating nurse shifted her stance, creating a clearer line between Avery and the table, not blocking, but defining space. Avery's eyes lifted briefly toward Caldwell's back, then dropped back to the monitor, her jaw tightening for a moment before relaxing. She adjusted her posture, shoulders back, chin level, returning to stillness, but her gaze did not soften. It moved more frequently now, shorter intervals, checking, recalibrating. The waveform dipped again, this time accompanied by a slight delay in the recovery, barely perceptible unless you were looking for it. Avery's hand rose again, slower, more deliberate, stopping midway as Caldwell's next instruction came through. Continue, he said, the single word carrying weight enough to override the moment. Avery's hand lowered, but not completely, hovering near the tubing, suspended between action and restraint. The room held that tension, unspoken, as each movement became more measured, more careful, the pressure no longer just in the procedure but in the space between what was seen and what was allowed to be done. Avery remained there, steady but not still, her attention fixed on the subtle shifts no one had acknowledged, her control intact but tested, each second stretching slightly longer than the last as the pattern on the monitor repeated without resolution. The pattern did not resolve, but it stopped getting worse, settling into a narrow band of inconsistency that stretched the seconds without breaking them. And the room adjusted to that uneasy balance, movement slowing by a fraction, voices dropping half a tone, as if everyone had agreed without speaking to conserve space for whatever might come next. Avery let her hand fall fully to her side this time, fingers uncurling gradually before resting against the seam of her scrub pants. She shifted her stance back an inch, then forward again, testing where she could stand without drawing attention. Her eye stayed on the monitor longer now, holding each waveform through a full cycle before moving away, then returning just before the next dip. Her blink rate slowed, one blink lingering a fraction too long before she reopened her eyes and refocused. The overhead light hummed softly, a steady electrical note that became more noticeable in the quiet. She adjusted the angle of her shoulders, not to face the table directly but to keep both the monitor and the infusion pump within her peripheral vision, a small recalibration that let her watch without appearing to. Across the table Dr. Caldwell's movements remained precise, but there was a slight pause before each instruction now, not hesitation, but a measured spacing, as if he were allowing the room to catch up to him rather than pulling it forward. He glanced once toward the monitor, briefly, then back to the field, his jaw setting a little tighter. The anesthesiologist leaned closer to his panel, fingers resting on a dial without turning it, eyes flicking between the numbers and Caldwell's profile. Waiting for a cue that did not come, Avery shifted her attention to the patient's hand again, watching the sensor where she had adjusted it earlier, the waveform clean at the source, the delay appearing only once it translated to the display. She pressed her lips together lightly, then released them, her breathing steady but slightly deeper now. She reached for a clipboard at the edge of the station, flipping it open to the current chart, her finger tracing a line she had already memorized, then moving back up one entry, then down again, as if confirming something without writing it. The pen in her pocket tapped once against the board as she leaned it back into place. She noticed a faint reflection of the monitor in the polished metal of a nearby instrument, the lag visible there too, smaller but consistent. She held her gaze on that reflection for a second longer than necessary before returning to the main screen. The circulating nurse shifted her weight, crossing and uncrossing her arms subtly, eyes moving between Avery and the table, not intervening, just aware. The resident adjusted his stance again, mirroring Caldwell less now, more focused on his own hands. Though his movement still followed the same rhythm, Avery rolled her shoulders once, slow and controlled, then stilled, grounding herself. The air felt cooler against the back of her neck where a strand of hair had slipped loose under her cap. She resisted the urge to adjust it, letting it stay, her attention narrowing again, mapping the sequence of lag and recovery. Her gaze flicked once more toward Caldwell, holding there for a brief second as if measuring whether to speak, then returning to the monitor without a word. The room remained suspended in that quiet tension, not escalating, not resolving, just holding, and somewhere beneath the surface of that stillness, a thought passed through her, fleeting and unspoken, that if this moment held your attention, it might be because something small here was about to matter more than it seemed. The lag repeated, longer this time, and then the waveform split for a fraction of a second before snapping back, a distortion too sharp to ignore. Avery's eyes locked onto it, not the number but the break itself, her hand moving. Before she fully stepped forward, fingers already at the infusion line as she traced it back to the pump, her thumb pressing the screen to pull up the recent log, a sequence of micro-delays stacked within the last minute, not random, not noise. There is a delay in the infusion, she said, voice steady, not raised. The anesthesiologist looked up immediately, crossing over in 2 steps to check the panel, his gloved hand scrolling through the same log, his posture shifting as the pattern confirmed. She is right, he said, more to the screen than the room, and then louder, flow rate is not matching input. Dr. Caldwell's hand stopped mid-motion, the instrument hovering just above the field, his eyes flicking to the monitor, then to the pump, the first break in his sequence. Check the line, he said, but the tone had changed, less directive, more reactive. The anesthesiologist was already ahead, adjusting the valve and flushing the line. The waveform responded within seconds, tightening, synchronizing cleanly with the displayed rate. The dip disappeared, replaced by a stable rhythm that held, not for a cycle, but for several. The resident exhaled audibly, shoulders dropping as his hands steadied. The circulating nurse stepped back half a pace, clearing space that had not been there before. Avery's hand remained on the pump for a moment longer, confirming the correction, then she withdrew, returning to her position without looking around. Dr. Caldwell resumed, but the timing was off by a beat, his next instruction delayed just enough for the room to notice. Continue, he said again, but the word carried a different weight now, less automatic. His gaze lingered on the monitor for an extra second before shifting back. The rhythm of the room adjusted, not to him alone this time, but to the stabilized line that had followed her intervention, and for the first time, the silence that settled was not compliance, but recognition of something that had already happened and could not be undone. Dr. Caldwell did not reach for the next instrument immediately, his hand hovering for a fraction longer than before, eye shifting not to the resident, but briefly toward the infusion pump. Avery had just adjusted, then back to the field. Maintain current rate, he said, but the instruction came after a pause that had not existed earlier. The resident waited a split second before moving, as if confirming the timing rather than anticipating it. The anesthesiologist remained closer to the pump now, one hand resting lightly on the panel, eyes tracking both the monitor and Avery's previous point of contact, not returning to his original position. The room's rhythm reassembled, but not perfectly aligned. There was a slight stagger in responses, a fraction of delay between command and execution. Dr. Caldwell resumed the sequence, but his gaze flickered more often toward the monitor, holding for a beat longer each time before returning to his work. When he extended his hand for an instrument, he glanced down first, confirming placement rather than assuming it. The surgical tech adjusted accordingly, placing each item with more visible care, the automatic flow replaced by something more deliberate. Avery remained where she was, her posture steady, hands relaxed at her sides, her eyes continuing their measured intervals between monitor, pump, and patient, not inserting herself again, not withdrawing either. When the waveform held steady through multiple cycles, she shifted her weight slightly, grounding her stance. The circulating nurse stepped back another half step, opening space that had previously been closed, her attention no longer fixed on limiting Avery's reach but distributed across the room. The resident adjusted his grip on the instrument, his movements less rigidly tied to Caldwell's rhythm, occasionally checking the monitor independently before proceeding. Dr. Caldwell issued another instruction, but his tone had softened at the edges, not in volume, but in cadence, less clipped, more measured. He paused mid-sentence once, recalibrating his wording before finishing. Proceed carefully, he added, the qualifier new, subtle but noticeable. The anesthesiologist made a minor adjustment without waiting for direction. then glanced toward Avery for a fraction of a second before returning to the panel, the acknowledgement. Brief but present, the monitor remained stable, the earlier lag gone, replaced by a clean synchronization that held across time rather than momentarily. Avery's gaze lingered on it once more, confirming consistency, then shifted away, her breathing even, her shoulders relaxed but not loose. Dr. Caldwell's next movement slowed slightly as he repositioned, his eyes scanning the field, then the monitor again, as if recalculating variables that had already been set. He did not look at Avery, but his positioning shifted just enough to keep the pump within his peripheral vision, a small adjustment that had not been necessary before. The room continued, functional, controlled, but the control was no longer singular. It was distributed, subtle, shared in ways that did not require acknowledgement. The silence between instructions carried a different weight now, not empty, but occupied by awareness, and though no one spoke of what had changed, it showed in the way hands moved, the way eyes checked, the way each action paused just long enough to account for something beyond a single voice. The procedure moved toward closure with a steadier rhythm, each action placed with care rather than speed, the monitor holding a clean, consistent line that no longer demanded attention every second. Dr. Caldwell lowered his hand slightly as the final steps approached, his gaze lingering once more on the infusion pump before returning to the field. When the last instrument was set aside, he did not speak immediately. The room waited, not tense, but attentive. He removed his gloves slowly, one finger at a time, then turned, not fully, but enough to face the side of the room where Avery stood. His eyes paused there for a brief moment, not searching, not avoiding, simply acknowledging. He nodded once, small, controlled, then shifted his focus to the resident. Document the adjustment in the report, he said, but the timing of it made the reference clear. The resident hesitated, then nodded, writing it down without question. The circulating nurse glanced toward Avery, then back to her station, her posture no longer guarded. Avery did not move forward or step back. She remained where she had been. Hand still, gaze neutral. The room began to reset, trays cleared, lights dimmed slightly, the hum of machines softened into the background again. As Avery turned to leave, she passed the monitor one last time, her eyes flicking to it briefly, confirming its steady rhythm, then continuing without pause. Behind her, the space she had occupied remained open, not closed off, not reassigned, just there, unchanged in a way that marked it differently than before. And as the doors opened quietly for her exit, the absence of interruption felt like its own final action. If this moment stayed with you, share your thoughts, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Thank you for being here.